excited to share with you some of the things I've put together today. I divided this, we talked about being pitfalls. I divided this into myths. So things people or parents or players say that they believe are true and that are hidden landmines. They don't know they're there. They have well intentions and they mean well and they try to get their son better, and they're walking into some fallacies here, and I want to go over them with you. So the first one, myth number one, going to a professional coach will help my son develop. So on the surface, that sounds great, but a lot of times what often happens is if you don't do the research, if it's not the right person, you can actually set your child back quite a bit, and God forbid even incur injuries in some cases, as I have seen. And so let's talk about that a little bit. There's different types of development coaches, and so the first one I have here is facility owner, Mr. Big Shot. Call him Mr. Big Shot because this is the person who's hired 5 or 10 college players that are young guys who are doing the coaching every day, and they're in their office on the phone and or not at the facility at all, and they're managing this whole thing. And they're not the one, they're using their credentials to carry the facility, but they're not the one doing the day-to-day teaching. And so I have to admit that when I was in Corpus Christi for the 10 years of having my facility, it ended up becoming such a big machine that I was one of these coaches. And it's one regret that I have, which has made my academy here in Austin the special thing that it has become, is because I've been there and I've done that. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work well because you're not having an impact on each player. And so, that person's credentials at that point doesn't matter because they're not the ones working with your players every single day. And so the next development coach, or they call themselves coaches, are players out of college or minor leagues. And that's great. There are some really great, talented former players that if mentored correctly and if they're taught how to communicate and how to coach, they're going to be great players, and there's nothing wrong with this. The problem is this. When you have players that say they're coaches, they were good players, but that doesn't, being a great player doesn't mean you're a great coach. The two don't correlate, and a lot of times they mix that together. And when you have one of these guys try to explain things, they use some fancy words and can't break it down and can't explain it because they have a very, very simplistic, very shallow understanding of it, and that it becomes troublesome. And so the other thing that happens is a lot of times these guys are young guys who, they don't have a lot invested in the facility. They're working, trying to, have their apartment, make ends meet, and then they go into their career track, whatever it may be, or they want a change of career because a lot of times doing lessons as a contracted coach as part of a bigger facility just doesn't end up well, or the players don't end up staying for a long time. And so what happens is the youth players, high school players that are being coached by these players, there's a lot of turnover. And so they continue to have different type of coaches. And a lot of times there's not a streamline of terminology and things. And the coach that's the former collegiate player or minor league player that call themselves professionals, they just teach the player the way they played and the way they know it. So a 6'5", right-handed pitcher ends up teaching a 5'8" left-handed pitcher in the same way that worked for him. And so sometimes that's also a problem. And then you have your third coach, the ex-major leaguer that sits on a bucket. So this is an interesting one. Great credentials, played in the major leagues, et cetera, but they are, they're just flipping balls to the kids, and their entitlement of where they have been and what they have done really keep them from being passionate and coaching and hustling and helping the player pick up balls so they have time to teach them more before the lesson's over. And so being on fire to teach the kids. I'll give you an example. I'm from Miami, Fort Lauderdale area, and worked for a large academy, probably the biggest academy in Miami, 15 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. And there was a major league player. At that time, there's 3 or 4 lessons going on. I'm the young coach. So at that point, I am the young coach that doesn't have all of that experience. But what went well was that I was on fire for my players, working really hard to teach them, giving them different examples, different metaphors, picking up the balls quickly because I want to get to the next thing. And so in the next cage next to me, there was a guy who had played in the major leagues for a year or two, had great credentials, and he'd just sit on the bucket and flip balls and was very disinterested. playing on his phone, things of that nature. And all of a sudden, the guy who had less experience, me at that time, started to take all the lessons from this other coach, because at that time, if their cages are next to each other and you can request which coach you want. And so you imagine, you see a dynamic individual really wanting to help the player versus somebody who's just kind of there, and you can kind of imagine where people want to be. And so that was real enlightening for me. And so what I've come to do now is try to be both. Now I have the experience and knowledge of all the things I have done, but I make sure I don't lose that fire for my players. And so be careful with that one. The credentials aren't exactly everything if they're not being used with really wanting to have energy, be high energy and dynamic for your player. Just resting on just the credentials won't make your player any better. The fact that that guy played in the major leagues will not make your player any better. It's a characteristic that could help, but sometimes it's not being used that way. And the fourth is a select team coach. Select team coach is, notice at the top I wrote development coaches. So there are some good select team coaches that understand the development side, and then they also are coaching the team on the field. Super important that you find somebody that you trust as a team coach to help you. The problem is even the good ones have a lot of trouble being able to completely dedicate themselves to the development, because there's tournament, there's games going on, there's things they have to work on, there's out of town trips. It's a big responsibility to keep all of those wheels moving. And so the development part is not at the forefront as far as the individual skills. So I know that there are some good ones in the area that develop within the game, how to play the game, all of those things. Super important. Definitely need to have someone like that. But on the other hand, there's coaches that just, they just hit balls and throw balls to kids, and they're not learning anything, and then they're not focused on development. Big problem. And then the last one is a highly qualified coach dedicated to development and works with all players. And so that's kind of what I was describing, my full circle here, from owning a big facility with 1,200 clients in Corpus and being the Mr. Big Shot facility owner. And prior to that, I've kind of gone through all of those stages to get me to the point now where I work with every single player. I don't have assistant coaches, and my experience helps me, coupled with really wanting to be there for my players when we're working, and really trying to do everything I can to make the players better, and not just, this is an hour's got to go by here. And so that's the last coach, and I would encourage you, if you're too far away or from our area, or if there's another person that you trust and you prefer, make sure they fall into that last category. Very important.